with my deepest regret and sorrow for my family and my children. Guilty.
How are Ruby Franke's 2 children doing in the aftermath of this horrific abuse? Well, we may have just gotten a glimpse through new court filings where Kevin Franke, Ruby's estranged husband, is going after Ruby's co-defendant, Jodi Hildebrandt. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. There has been one detail that we really haven't gotten an answer to in the Ruby Franke saga. The case, of course, about the once famous YouTuber who recently pled guilty to aggravated child abuse charges of her 2 own young children. And that detail, that missing question has been, how are these kids doing? Well, in newly filed court documents, we may have gotten an answer. Now, Franke was the Utah mom of 6 who started a popular YouTube channel known as 8 Passengers back in 2015. Tons of videos about the family's lives, their parenting techniques, their activities. She ended up partnering with a licensed mental health counselor named Jodi Hildebrandt in a life skills coaching organization known as Connections that was really run by Jodi Hildebrandt. And then in August of 2023, both women were arrested after police found Franke's 2 malnourished, abused children at Hildebrandt's residence. Recently, both women pled guilty to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. We learned that the kids were forced to work outside in the summer heat. They sustained blisters and burns. One of those children was severely bound, ended up having all these injuries from being tied up. Both the kids were not provided adequate food and water, and in more extreme examples, Franke admitted to kicking her 12-year-old son Russell with boots and holding his head underwater, and Hildebrandt forced Eve, Franke's 9-year-old daughter, to jump into a cactus. I mean, we're talking horrible, horrible stuff. Both women are set to be sentenced in February 20th to be exact, and each charge carries 1 to 15 years in prison, and based on their plea agreements, these sentences will run consecutively, meaning one after the other. But now, let's talk about the new development. In a filing from Randy Kester, who is representing Ruby's estranged husband, Kevin, he actually filed for divorce after Ruby's arrest, he is demanding restitution from Jodi Hildebrandt. In other words, he wants her to literally pay. For what? For the effects of what she did, namely the medical costs. The document says, quote, "The children have undergone medical care and have been subjected to psychological assessments and ongoing mental health treatment in an attempt to assist them in comprehending and recovering from these injuries. The children remain in professional care for the aggravated psychological and emotional injuries suffered. It is clear and admitted that the children suffered immediate and continuing irreparable harm as a result of the crimes perpetrated upon them by this defendant." And it goes on to state that the children will require long-term professional care moving forward, likely for many years. Now, based on what we read about these kids and what they went through, none of this should be surprising. Because on top of all of the physical abuse that I laid out, and there is a lot more, let's not forget what the plea agreement also says, that the kids were forced to repent, that they were evil, that this punishment was being done for their own good. Can you imagine what that's like for 2 young children to experience that and try to recover from that? In fact, I remember when I interviewed Jessie Hildebrandt, Jodi's niece, who also claims that she was the victim of severe emotional and psychological and physical abuse at the hands of Jodi Hildebrandt. But she talked about the psychological trauma to come for these kids.
The emotional and spiritual abuse, I mean, it took me, I mean, I'm still in therapy every week for it. There's no, and again, it was almost 15 years ago, and I'm still daily, like, I mean, through this experience for months, there's been a tremendous amount of healing on my end, which just goes to show how important accountability is for the victims.
Right.
But no, I mean, this doesn't, the invisibility of harm almost, it makes it even worse, because you know, if those kids didn't have those horrifying physical marks on their bodies, would this ever have been intervened? And it's horrifying, but like the marks that of the emotional abuse will significantly outlast any physical.
Now, the way that we understand it is that the state is paying for all of these expenses because the kids are in state custody. So they're paying for this treatment. But Kevin is actively seeking full custody of these kids. And if successful, which in this court filing suggests that the custody issue could be resolved by September of 2024, eventually he will have to be responsible for these costs. The filing states, quote, once the juvenile court matter concludes, the cost for this ongoing critical professional help will fall upon the children and their father. This would be a completely inequitable result that the victims and victims' family would have to pay for their own treatment for injuries caused by the defendant. Now, to be clear, there is law cited by Mr. Kester in this filing to support this. It's called the Crime Victims Restitution Act. And in Utah, this law states, quote, when a defendant enters into a plea disposition or is convicted of a criminal activity that has resulted in pecuniary damages, the court shall order that the defendant make restitution to any victim of crime as provided in this chapter, or for conduct for which the defendant has agreed to make restitution as part of a plea disposition. Now, there are also two forms of restitution. So in determining restitution, the court shall determine complete restitution and court-ordered restitution, two separate things. Complete restitution means restitution necessary to compensate a victim for all losses caused by the defendant, and court-ordered restitution means the restitution the court, having criminal jurisdiction, orders the defendant to pay as part of the criminal sentence at the time of sentencing or within 1 year after sentencing. So it's a little bit different. It overlaps here and there, but one is about compensating the victim fully for what happened, and another is a part of the sentencing. Now, also I should tell you that the court will consider all relevant facts when determining restitution. If Jody objects to the restitution, quote, the court shall allow the defendant to have a hearing on the issue unless the issue is addressed at the sentencing hearing for the defendant. So it seems that we may get more of an answer on this, or discussion at the very least, at the sentencing hearing, or it may move over to a future hearing. And by the way, Kevin is only going after Jody Hildebrand, which is not surprising since Connections was basically her business. She founded it. But also, he wouldn't go after Ruby for the money. But it also is very consistent with the statement from Ruby's law firm before she pled guilty, where she put basically a lot, if not all, of the blame on Jody for what happened. But B, Randy Kester, when we interviewed him here on Law&Crime, has said that Jody was the driving influence behind Kevin's separation from Ruby, that she, Jody Hildebrand, is responsible.
During the separation, Kevin was attending men's groups that were facilitated by Jody, and during those groups, he was being downgraded and diminished, and told how bad he was, and that he needed to repent, and that the best way to repent was to not infect his family with his problems, and so that's why you need to stay away. He wasn't the only one in those men's groups that was undergoing exactly what he was undergoing at her suggestion and recommendation.
So again, not surprising that they are saying it is her fault and she needs to pay up. The part that is really interesting to me in this filing, where does all the money come from? So the filing states, quote, the defendant has assets and resources sufficient to assist in the payment of this restitution in the form of real estate, financial accounts, and other personal property. Let's start with that last part, the property and the accounts. So, quote, the defendant owns other personal property of value, including automobiles, a side-by-side, and at the time of the commission of these crimes, had financial accounts, including but not limited to proposed checking, savings, certificates of deposit, 401k, and all other such accounts either in the name of the defendant or being held by other third parties or entities, including but not limited to Pam Botcher, Connections LLC, or other third parties or entities. Now, be clear, Pam Botcher is the president of Connections Foundation. She was actually on that body cam footage from officers when they found Ruby's other two young children at Pam's house in American Fork, Utah. At the time, she had picked them up before Ruby's arrest, but Pam Botcher hasn't been charged with any crimes or anything like that. Talking all of these legal issues in the Franke case, let me just take a minute to thank Attorney Tom and Associates for sponsoring this episode of Sidebar. As you know from stories like the Franke one, this is an unpredictable world, right? And sometimes you're going to need a lawyer. But finding the right legal assistance is so important, and that is where Attorney Tom comes in. Whether you were injured in a car wreck or refinery explosion, or the victim of securities fraud, or received a notification that your information was included in a data breach, developed an illness as a result of a bad drug or toxic exposure, and there are so many other situations, Attorney Tom can help. You see, what Tom and his team do so well is they not only have the legal knowledge, of course, but they have genuine empathy for their clients, and having someone you can trust is invaluable. And by the way, every call is free. It's private. You'll be speaking with a member of his team straight away. You won't pay a dime until you win, which just shows their commitment to your success. And they have an impressive track record in tough cases. And look, if your case is not the best fit for Attorney Tom and his team, don't worry, because they still may be able to recommend you a lawyer because they have a national network of attorneys they can refer you to. With Attorney Tom and his team, you're not just hiring a lawyer. You are getting powerful allies who are committed to justice and your well-being. So if you've suffered an injury and you need legal support, click the attorneytom.com/sidebar link pinned in the comments for a free consultation, or dial 855-TOM-WINS. Theoretically, these different forms of property could potentially be used to satisfy a restitution order. But then there is the real estate. Quote, petitioner discovered that on or about Thursday, January 4th, 2024, this is, by the way, after Jodi Hildebrand pled guilty, the defendant, Jodi Hildebrand, has listed for sale her home and real property located in Ivins, Utah, which was at least one location where these crimes were committed against the children. The listing for sale of the home has, as a listing price, $5.1 million. Wow. I guess that was a successful practice that she had. Goes on to say, quote, it is assumed that there is significant equity in the home. However, without knowledge of the existing mortgage, petitioner, this is, of course, Kevin Franke, is not aware of the exact amount of anticipated profit. However, to the extent there is profit, the children should be entitled to a share sufficient to provide restitution for any and all ongoing expenses that they incur as a result of this defendant's crimes against them. Now, the court has to balance not only these financial resources of Hildebrand in determining restitution, or what the restitution amount should be, but also the burden that this would impose in light of Hildebrand's other creditors and financial obligations. So it's a little bit of a test there for the court. However, as Randy Kester lays out, they need the court to act quickly on this. Why? Because the defendant, they say, is in the process of assigning, disposing of, or concealing the property, and there is probable cause of losing the remedy of restitution unless the court issues the writ and or the temporary restraining order. And that order would stop Hildebrand from selling or transferring any of this property in any way until restitution can be resolved. So the idea here is that we have to make sure there's something still here, something left over in order to pay for the kids' costs. So Kevin is asking for an emergency order stopping Hildebrand from doing anything with her assets until this restitution is heard at a sentencing on February 20th. And we will see what happens. It's going to be interesting. But at the very least, I think the biggest takeaway from all of this, just incredibly sad to hear what these two young children are apparently going through, what they need to do in order to recover. Difficult for any victim, let alone two young children. That is all we have for you here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.